I'm here with Dr. Gerald Horne, who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research focuses on racism and white supremacy, political economy, civil rights, and international politics, among other various topics. He's the author of, I think, somewhere around 40 books. Is that correct, Dr. Horne?
It's in the ballpark.
Some of his titles include Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America from 2014. His 2018 title, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. The Dawning of Apocalypse, Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. That's from 2020. And I think just a couple of days ago, you released a new title, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of US Fascism. Dr. Horne has also written books on the film industry, jazz, and the political economy of boxing. Dr. Horne, thank you for taking the time to talk with me this morning.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'd like to begin by asking you for your thoughts on the rise of the far right in America and the legacy of pan-European whiteness and white supremacy that you've detailed in some of those books I just mentioned. I'm curious to hear your appraisal of how this legacy is continued through contemporary events like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan in 2020, and of course the coup of January 6, 2021. Can you talk us through some of this history and maybe focus on what you've called militarized identity politics? And I'm particularly interested in what you've called cross-class collaboration and how something like cross-class collaboration has contributed to these events and the rise of the right more generally.
Well, first of all, it's appropriate that you mentioned January 6th, the apparent plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer, the Buffalo massacre, the Uvalde massacre. I think it's important to recognize that these apparent disconnected episodes are all connected and in fact have deep historical roots. In my book on the 16th century, I talk about how it was that the Iberians, the Spanish and the Portuguese, who had first movers advantage in terms of invading the Americas. After all, it was the people we refer to as the Spanish who sponsored Christopher Columbus. But yet somehow here in North America, we are sitting here speaking English. And in order to understand that, you have to understand the point that the dominant axis of society in Europe at that particular moment was a religious axis, the Catholic Christians versus the Protestant Christians post 1517, post the Martin Luther secession. The Martin Luther secession takes London by storm. To telescope a very complicated, complex argument, what happens is that London wants to get on the colonial feast. The Spanish are bent and determined on having a religious qualification for their settler enterprise in the Americas. You could be African and be a conquistador if you profess Catholicism. Improvising madly and wildly, the English move towards pan-Europeanism, which morphs into whiteness and morphs into white supremacy. This involves a class collaborationist ethos, particularly if you look at the initial settlement, failed settlement of London in North Carolina in the 1580s, which involved settlers from the pan-European community, from different class backgrounds, all sponsored by the elite in London. And that is the seed of settler colonialism in North America. That is to say, pan-Europeanism, to the point where Maryland, as you know, a current US state, when it was, quote, settled, unquote, by London in the 17th century, the leaders of that enterprise were Catholics, which it would have been unthinkable for the Spanish Catholics to have Protestants in the vanguard of their settler project. And so we begin to see how this notion of class collaboration takes off early on with regard to London's enterprises. And likewise, with regard to trying to shed light upon the recent tragedies in Buffalo and Uvalde, Texas, it's important to interrogate not only the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, which has been interpreted by the right as guaranteeing a proliferation of weapons. Right now, there are more weapons in the United States than there are people. There are 330 million people in the United States of America. But it's important to recognize that this Second Amendment from the vaunted US Bill of Rights did not necessarily apply to the indigenous population. All you have to do is look at so-called cowboy movies where there was no one more scorned than a settler who sold weapons to Native Americans. And certainly it didn't apply to the Africans. None of the Bill of Rights applied to the Africans, by the way. And so this was a way, the Second Amendment, to arm the settlers so that they could better expropriate the land from the Native Americans and keep the Africans in line, the enslaved Africans in line. And today, in 2022, it's taken on other characteristics. That is to say, the right wing routinely tells us that they believe in proliferation of weapons because if a government comes to power which they do not approve, they want to be able to shoot it out of power, basically, with armed uprisings. And then we know that there is a profit motive in terms of this industry, headquartered in the United States, which, according to a recent analyst, sends a river of weapons south of the border, complicating life in Mexico, Haiti, and other sites too numerous to mention. But once again, you have to understand the settler ethos, which is basically class collaborations. By class collaborationists, I mean the poorer settlers uniting with the middle class settlers and the affluent settlers. That's why I'm afraid to say that the otherwise worthy slogan of the 1% versus the 99% coming out of the Occupy movement is somewhat misleading because we know that there are many in the 99% who, of course, align electorally with the 1%. That's the secret of Donald Trump getting 74, 75 million votes in 2020, despite all of his transgressions and misdeeds. It's more that we have the 1/3 comprised disproportionately, overwhelmingly, of those who resemble the original settlers across class lines. I mean, after all, in one of the poorest states, West Virginia, Donald Trump won it by 40 points in 2020. And you just had a congressional primary where the winning Republican candidate ran on opposing aid to his constituency. I mean, this is how demented this right-wing ethos has become. So as noted, it's more like the 1/3 versus the 2/3. And then the institutions help to validate and undergird minority rule. That's why we have an electoral college, which allows Hillary Clinton to get 3 million more popular votes than Donald J. Trump in 2016 and still lose. That's why we have 9 unelected politicians and rogues on the US Supreme Court who have the right to snatch away women's reproductive freedom, perhaps in a decision arising in a few weeks of further eroding gun control. That's why you have a US Senate where Wyoming, which has about 2% of the size of the 40 million strong California population, but both states have 2 senators, which basically means that a vote in Wyoming is worth more than a vote in California. It's all designed to protect the rule of a plutocratic minority, which originally would have been a slave-owning minority, for example. So these are just some of my reflections on your question.
Great. Thank you for that thorough answer. You kind of touched on some of this in your answer, but I wanted to ask you, briefly, you touched on some of the shootings that we've had as of late in Texas and in Buffalo, and I want to get to those in a minute. But I want to ask you specifically about your latest book on Texas and the origins of American fascism, and how that might, how Texas in particular might factor into this cross-class collaboration, this project of whiteness and white supremacy, and of course the power of the American right wing today.
Well, as I tell the story, Texas distills 2 of the more tragic and unfortunate aspects of US history. That is to say, Texas is where the Old South meets the Wild West. The Old South being the enslavement of Africans. Texas today has the largest Black population in the United States of America. This stems in part from the point that as the slave owners' rebellion was collapsing, that is to say the US Civil War, 1861 to 1865, you had many enslavers from Virginia, Georgia, points east, moving with their enslaved property in tow to Texas, which also shed light on why this state now has the largest Black population. But Texas also encapsulates what we oftentimes refer to as the Wild West. That is to say, many states, including your own Colorado, can compete for the title of being the champion of genocide against Native Americans. But I would argue that because of its size, Texas is the largest state geographically in the so-called lower 48. That is to say, the largest pre-1959, before Alaska enters the Union. And Texas also had some of the most militant, fearsome indigenous populations, speaking of the Comanches in the first instance, the Lords of the Plains, and the various branches of the people we refer to as the Apaches as well. And then at a time when Texas had seceded from Mexico in 1836 on the basis of Mexico moving towards abolition of slavery under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, as I tell the story, this was not unlike the slave owners in 1776 seceding from the British Empire, because London had given indications of moving towards abolition, as embodied in Somerset's case in 1772, a case so notorious that it's been the subject of cinema. I recommend to your audience the film Belle, B-E-L-L-E, which in part deals with Somerset's case. And so this combination of enslavement, setting up a Slavocracy, a government and an economic project based upon free labor of Africans, along with steadily expropriating the land of fearsome indigenous populations who do not want to relinquish their land, that creates this toxic combination in Texas. And of course, it is manifested in class collaboration, that is to say, poor Europeans, oftentimes migrants fresh off the boat, arriving in Galveston, Texas, and enlisted into these various xenophobic projects involving enslavement of one group and liquidating another group. So if you look at fascism, a subject I tackled in an earlier book I wrote about a figure by the name of Lawrence Dennis, who we might call a light-skinned Negro, but he passed for, quote, white, unquote, and became the leader of US fascism. And of course, fascism was seemingly taking the world by storm in the 1930s and 1940s. But to telescope a very complex situation, fascism oftentimes has involved genocide, of which of course was embedded in the political and cultural DNA of Texas. Fascism oftentimes has involved enslavement. We've already made reference to the enslavement of Africans, for example, in the production of wealth based upon free labor, not unlike the labor camps in Central and Eastern Europe in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Fascism oftentimes has involved a kind of runaway patriarchy as well, which you see in Texas with SB 8, which not only seeks to deprive women of reproductive freedom, but turn fellow Texans into bounty hunters who can recover a bounty from the state to the extent that they squeal on these women. And then, referencing your previous question and my previous answer, we see attempts to rig elections, for example, to prevent democratic outcomes of elections, such as on January 6th, with the instrumentalities in place to allow for that kind of minority rule, reference the Electoral College, the right-wing US Supreme Court, et cetera. So it's no accident that when you begin to think of the horror of horrors, that is to say a potential US fascism, your mind alights on the state of Texas. Your mind alights on Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, for example, or Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, for example. Because of Texas's size, second only in population to California, inevitably it overrepresents the right wing in the US House of Representatives, for example, which is based upon population, as you know. So there are a number of disturbing signs that point to a very grim reality that we can only avoid by seeking to deepen our analysis of this country in which we find ourselves, and also seeking to organize in different ways. One of the lessons I've tried to bring forward with regard to Black American history in particular is that the route out of slavery and out of Jim Crow, in part, was not only a route involving self-assertion and organizing, but also internationalism. We cannot separate the abolition of slavery from the rise of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignites a general crisis of the entire slave system, which could only be resolved with its collapse, with Haiti seeking to stem the tide of the slave trade. And given the fact that London's cash cow, Jamaica, was nearby Haiti, London saw the better part of wisdom and decided before the United States to move away from the slave trade, to move away from slavery itself. By the 1830s, Haiti sponsoring slave revolts in the Americas, developing a navy that sought to block the import of more Africans, particularly to neighboring Cuba, where Texas was largely responsible in helping to increase the population of the enslaved between 1836, when Texas seceded from Mexico, to 1845, when it crawled into the Union. Recall that Texas was an independent state before then, with the Lone Star flag of Texas, flagging ships found off the coast of Angola in Southwest Africa, off the coast of Brazil as well. And so Black Americans were involved in this international discourse concerning slavery, international organizing, involving abolition. And something similar happens with stage 2 of oppression, which is Jim Crow, US apartheid, which was an international project in terms of combating it. And one of the issues we have lost is this internationalism. But I dare say that if we are to dig ourselves out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves, somehow we're going to have to revive this internationalism.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you actually touched on a couple points on internationalism and the left that I wanted to get to. You also touched on the concept of legal fascism, more or less, with regard to Texas and some of these legal procedures we're seeing in the Supreme Court and in Texas and Florida and Oklahoma and elsewhere regarding abortion. And we could even mention the eroding rights of LGBTQ plus citizens and things of that nature. It seems like Texas has been at the epicenter of that kind of movement in the judiciary and elsewhere. I'm curious on the topic of the judiciary. There's all these reports coming out and these leaks of text messages, excuse me, and emails from Ginny Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas. How do you see that whole situation playing out with regard to the Supreme Court, the January 6th Commission, and Ginny Thomas's intimate role in the coup of January 6th?
Well, there are a number of revelations flooding out about January 6th. For example, part of the latest revelations are that Larry Ellison, a fortune of 85 billion, mostly involved in the corporation Oracle, which does enterprise software, was involved in conversations post the first Tuesday in November about the election. I wonder what the substance of those conversations were. I wonder if it had anything to do with drawing upon Mr. Ellison's obvious knowledge about computer systems and software, for example. Hopefully the January 6th Commission, when they begin their televised hearings in a few days, will tackle this subject. We know, in terms of the revelations trickling out, that apparently Donald J. Trump was hardly dissatisfied with the slogan, "Hang Mike Pence," speaking of his vice president, speaking of the chant of many of the so-called insurrectionists on January 6th, speaking of the gallows they had constructed on the grounds of the Capitol. And then you mentioned Ginny Thomas, the spouse of the senior sitting Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, who obviously is in on the conspiracy up to her eyeballs. Interestingly enough, I doubt if this will, A, cause Mr. Thomas to recuse himself from any rulings coming out of January 6th, or second, I doubt if there will be any serious attempt to impeach him, given the correlation of forces. And just as a footnote here, I think we really need realism with regard to the electorate. I'm a critic of the Democratic Party. I've even run a political campaign against the Democratic Party. But sometimes our friends on the left, they act as if the Republican Party is not the problem. The real problem is the lack of courage of the Democrats. Now, that is a problem, but I always get nervous and suspicious when the Republican Party, which is basically the party of whiteness, it's basically a monochromatic party. It's basically a party that most resembles the origins of settler colonialism. And so when I see our friends on the left, who can be defined as white, come up with what amount to de facto excuses for the Republican Party, it makes me very nervous. It makes me very nervous, I must confess. But in any event, I think January 6th is just the beginning, I'm afraid to say, because it's apparent that the Republicans are seeking to occupy offices such as Secretary of State in the 50 different states, which have oversight over elections and election machinery. If, as happened post-November 2020, when Donald J. Trump called into Georgia and say, find me 11,000 votes so that I can prevail in Georgia, presumably going forward, there will be secretaries of state who will find those 11,000 votes. And so we're obviously on the path to anti-democracy, but I think that it's important to recognize that this is a path that in part is impelled by the vaunted Constitution, which even has been sacralized by the left, seeing it something sacred, though it helped to engender minority rule of slave owners before 1861, and now is helping to impel a different kind of minority rule. Sometimes I wonder if many of our friends on the left have been seduced by half-truths. By half-truths meaning that it's apparent that those who were persecuted on religious grounds in Europe found a different environment in the settlements of North America. Many of our friends on the left then absolutize that and say, oh, this is a great step forward for humanity. This is great. But what they somehow failed to recognize is that this was a maneuver designed to create a bloc sufficiently potent to snatch land from Native Americans and enslave the Africans. That's part two. They only look at part one. I mean, I did a book on Southern Africa. And when apartheid is established in South Africa in 1948, which, as you know, is a kind of rigid racism combined with a kind of slavery, in part, it was designed to lift up the poor Afrikaner population. The Afrikaners, of course, being the descendants of the original Dutch settlers in the 17th century, post-1652, supplemented by French Protestants fleeing France a few decades later. And so it occurred to me as I was writing, if these were US leftists looking at apartheid, they would say, oh, this is great that they're trying to uplift the poor Afrikaners. This can be a prelude to uplifting poor Africans. No, it wasn't a prelude. It was a way to solidify the enslavement of poor Africans. And so part of the process of digging ourselves out of this deep hole we find ourselves in is having a clear understanding of the history of this country in which we reside, and also stop making excuses for genocide, for example. Although, in all fairness, I'm heartened by the fact that there is a growing sensitivity to indigenous questions in this country, as represented by many acknowledging in ways large and small that they are residing on the unceded land of the Arapaho or the Cheyenne or the Comanches, et cetera. This is a significant step forward, but we still have a long way to go.
That actually brings up another question I have for you, and you kind of touched on this in part with regard to the concept of settler colonialism and these kind of your critique of the left, or of this critique of the Democrats coming from the left. I'm of course speaking about what you've called left-wing white nationalism. And I find that particularly interesting, how you've written about settler colonialism as a term that you find curiously absent from the ordinary discourse on the left. And I think you recently also critiqued Du Bois on a similar kind of omission in his work, Black Reconstruction. Can I ask why maybe just dovetailing with your question, with your answer, with regard to this kind of critique of the Democrats that you find lacking. Why has the left in America been so reluctant to confront settler colonialism, counter-revolution, the history of slavery, and has, as you put it, imposed an ersatz class unity that is brutally at odds with historical reality? Is this a kind of a strategic avoidance on the left, or is there something else going on here?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I think it's a mechanical application of Marxist principles. That is to say that we should, and I underline should, expect a certain kind of class unity, but without understanding the history of settler colonialism and how it was constructed based upon class collaboration, we'll miss the boat and then mechanically try to apply a class unity to a situation, to a country that is based upon class collaboration. And with regard to the point about the Democrats, actually, you can find a glimpse of what I was making reference to. It's rather predictable whenever there is a mass shooting in the United States, which come all too often. I'll get a message from Press TV in Iran to come on to talk about it. And so I was on the other day in light of Uvalde with a fellow US national of the left. And as I was providing explanations, including some of which I've shared with you today, involving a gun culture which undergirds expropriation of land of Native Americans and keeping Africans in line, et cetera, my fellow panelists went off on a tirade about the Democratic Party, which, as I said, I've run against the Democratic Party. I stand second to none in my critique of them, but that seemed particularly off-putting. It's almost as if you're trying to provide a pass for the party of whiteness, for the Republican Party, which after all stands foursquare against any weak-kneed reforms. It's a kind of ultra-leftism, which is all too prevalent, I'm afraid to say, on the US left. And ultra-leftism oftentimes objectively then begins to provide a cover for white supremacy and right-wing politics. And that brings me to that article I wrote against left-wing white nationalism, which was in part a reflection of the point that we've had some historiographical breakthroughs lately. I think of the book by the late scholar Tyler Stovall, White Freedom, which points to what we refer to as bourgeois democratic rights, as basically racialized rights, like the vaunted Bill of Rights, which I referenced a moment or two ago, which did not apply to my ancestors, did not apply to Native Americans, and actually did not apply to many poor settlers as well, even though they supported it wholeheartedly, like the voters in the Republican Party primary in West Virginia, aforementioned, who voted for a candidate who was pledged to deprive them of whatever benefits they get from the government. I mean, this is the kind of madness that we're dealing with. But also the late philosopher Charles Mills, Jamaican descent, his book, The Racial Contract. I make reference to Ishmael Reed, the paramount Black intellectual, who did a send-up and spoof of Hamilton, the Disney come Broadway extravaganza, lauding the so-called founding fathers in a very antiseptic manner. And so, and then of course, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who's tried to rewrite the history of the indigenous population. She, of course, is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so that was a prelude to talking about points which we've already referenced today, which is class collaboration amongst the settler class, about how during the era of slavery, there was a particularly noxious form of class collaboration whereby poor settlers were in a sense deputized and incentivized to return runaway slaves, for example. and to squeal on runaway slaves. I mean, that was the system that was constructed. And so rather than deal with this complicated, complex history, we sort of parachute, or some of us parachute into the 1930s. That's when our history begins, with mass organizing drives. Mass organizing drives, by the way, oftentimes driven by a fear of the rise of socialism, for example. Or we begin our story in the 1960s with unrest, some of which I participated in. But once again, oftentimes that's driven by external events. That is to say, this adaptation the United States is making to a new world, whereby African nations and Caribbean nations are coming to independence and looking askance at the United States as the so-called paragon of human rights virtue and its ongoing ideological contestation, and oftentimes military and political contestation with the socialist camp. And so the United States feels it has to loosen the chains of Jim Crow in order to present a better public image. But if you just see these significant shifts in the 1930s and the 1960s as driven solely by internal dynamics, you'll basically miss the boat. You will not grasp the nettle of class collaboration. You will misunderstand class struggle. And that's part of what I was trying to convey in that article against left-wing white nationalism. Now, with regard to Du Bois, I did a review essay in The Nation, the left-leaning New York-based weekly. A newer version of his magnum opus from 1935, Black Reconstruction, has just been published. And Black Reconstruction, as you know, deals with the period following the US Civil War, roughly 1865 to 1877, the attempt of the newly emancipated to become citizens of the erstwhile slaveholders' republic, how it's drowned in blood by the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groupings. And by the way, I've noticed that in Denver, your newspaper, at least for a while, had on its website some primary source material about the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado and in Denver, which I read a few months ago and I found very intriguing. And I hope scholars in Colorado make something of it. But in any case, I criticized Du Bois on a number of grounds. The grounds that are relevant for our discussion here is that he doesn't really engage the Native American question, for example, which I think is obviously a flaw. And he talks blithely about the now popular slogan of 40 acres and a mule. By the way, the name of the production company of Spike Lee, the Black filmmaker, one of his more popular films, as I recall, was cited in your own Colorado, Black Klansman. And Du Bois apparently does not recognize this land that he's seeking to redistribute as the fruit of a poisonous tree. And then the other point that I make, and this goes back to my Texas project, which is that you have the anomaly, the searing contradiction, if you like, of Black people in East Texas terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan at this fraught moment. By the way, some of the more recent literature on lynching talks about not only lynching as a pre-radio, pre-television spectacle, where thousands of settlers or descendants of settlers would amass for this show of seeing this Black person literally being burned at the stake, gasoline tossed upon him along with matches, occasionally women too, by the way. And as I point out in an earlier Nation article that I did a review essay on the book Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, I point out, per my earlier remarks, that in the 1500s, you had Catholics burning Protestants at the stake Then fast forward to the late 19th century in North America, in the settlement, you have Catholics and Protestants joining hands, sometimes with Jewish Americans, and burning Africans at the stake. That's sort of an encapsulation of this transition from religion to race, which is a thesis of my 16th century book. And so back to Du Bois, it's not only this anomaly, this Assyrian contradiction of having Black people terrorized in East Texas, but at the same time in West Texas, you have Black soldiers in the Buffalo Soldiers who are terrorizing the indigenous population. They're at the tip of the spear oftentimes when the Apaches, the Mescalero Apaches and the Lipan Apaches are being routed. And obviously that's unsustainable. It's contradictory. It's horrific. And I point out that this seems to elude the great Du Bois. So it's no excuse to say that it's also eluded a number of contemporary scholars who have the benefit of living in an era where you've had an efflorescence of scholarship on Native Americans and an efflorescence of a growing sensitivity to indigenous questions. The fact that in 2022, that era is being made is not a reason to exculpate Du Bois in 1935.
Great, yeah, thank you for that sweeping answer. You just mentioned this pre-cinema and pre-television phenomenon of this kind of communal, carnivalesque of burning Africans at the stake in the 1900s and into the 20th century. This makes me think about, of course, the modern day lynchings of Black Americans that we see circulated on the web and on social media. And even last week, the Buffalo shooting, if I'm not mistaken, was live streamed somehow on social media or on some sort of channel or website. I'd like to turn to that topic actually, if you don't mind, and some of these, and actually try to link it to your previous answer about kind of these internal and external dynamics of the United States, because clearly there was an unambiguously white supremacist motive behind the Buffalo mass killing. And I heard this idea floating around that the shooter in that mass killing sported a black sun tattoo, which has been associated with the neo-Nazis. And there was evidence of neo-Nazi soldiers in Ukraine sporting the same symbology. I'm not trying to suggest that there's some sort of intimate connection here, but there's clearly a symbolic and an ideological one. And the US and Ukraine have both been safe havens for Nazism and white supremacy. Keeping this in mind, as thinking also about what we've seen at the border of the United States, asylum seekers from Central and South America being turned away in great numbers, Haitian refugees being whipped at the border by patrolmen on horseback, and the parallel treatment of African students on the Polish-Ukrainian border recently, all while Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed into the United States, I think by the tens of thousands. I'm just curious what you might have to say about those kind of parallel phenomenon. Is there a history behind that phenomenon? What might countries or other nations be? How might these events be covered in the media that doesn't fall into the sphere of Western influence or the Euro-American ideology?
Well, with regard to the latter, I find it interesting that the corporate media, say the New York Times, for example, has done a better job of covering the point that despite the common statement that the world is united with regard to sanctions against Russia, well, obviously that's not true. I mean, Africa is not united, which helped to motivate the recent trip to Africa by Chancellor Scholz of Germany, who flew into South Africa and was lectured by President Ramaphosa of South Africa, who said that instead of trying to enlist me in the campaign, you should engage in engagement, dialogue, negotiations. That was our route out of apartheid, which of course Mr. Schultz did not want to hear. And if you look at the vote at the United Nations on expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council, it's just a fact that a disproportionate number of African and Latin American states did not sign on to that particular initiative. And I think that those who are sincerely concerned about Ukraine and are sincerely concerned about Moscow's intervention should take this to heart. And then they should take to heart why it is that so many in Africa, after witnessing the depredations inflicted upon Libya in 2011, upon Iraq in 2003, upon Afghanistan up until August 2021, they're not necessarily willing to sweep all that under the rug and then supposedly do a 180-degree reversal and join these North Atlantic nationals in campaigning against Russia. I think that those sincerely concerned about Ukraine should really take to heart that contradiction and how it is being viewed in what is called the global South. Likewise, I think that they should take to heart what you mentioned in your setup question, which is the disparate treatment of Ukrainians on the US-Mexico border and those who are not, in the infamous words of a TV commentator from the United States, who don't happen to have blonde hair and blue eyes. They should take to heart the point made by right-wing New York Times columnist Bret Stephens a few days ago, that the United States should not only accept what Mr. Biden has spoken of, accepting 100,000 Ukrainians. Bret Stephens said that each one should have a green card placed in their hand, which would allow for benefits, social welfare benefits upon landing on these shores. We have seen no such effort with regard to the Haitians, whipped like enslaved Africans on the Texas-Mexico border as recently as a few months ago, subjected to all manner of science fiction depredations, including cyber pooches, these robots that resemble dogs that chase them down, or the ankle monitors that are wrapped around their ankles once they enter this country, which oftentimes burst into flames. So there are many contradictions with regard to this Ukraine crisis. And I think, once again, those who are sincerely interested in finding a way out should really grapple with these contradictions, because it's going to be very difficult for there to be unity with regard to future and present struggles unless we grapple with these contradictions. And likewise, I mentioned on Press TV in that aforementioned interview on gun violence that we need to factor in how the murders and killings inflicted on these foreign sites, too numerous to mention, such as Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya in the first instance, how that cheapening of life and having the resolution of problems emerge from the barrel of a gun, how that then returns to the United States with a vengeance, helping to convince certain callow youth that the way to reconcile contradictions is through the barrel of a gun, for example. And likewise, I think we need to recognize, as I have pointed out in a number of interviews, that this present crusade, these sanctions against Russia, are really only part one of a larger battle. Part two emerged a few days ago when Mr. Biden was in Northeast Asia, where he was meeting with the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, United States, which is sort of this anti-China formation. And China is really the big enchilada. And the idea is you weaken Russia, which supplies many raw materials to China, and then you go for the big enchilada, which is China. Of course, coincidentally enough, as Mr. Biden was speaking in Northeast Asia, there was a military exercise involving Russian bombers and Chinese bombers flying in the vicinity. Beijing and Moscow said that this was totally coincidental. Others are not so sure. Others suspect it was a kind of figurative shot over the bow. In any case, we're wading into choppy waters with regard to this latest conflict, now featuring the North Atlantic nations versus China and Russia. I expect a bit of wobbliness on the part of European so-called allies. You already see that with the Rome peace plan. I always suspected ever since February 24th, that Italy would be the first to break ranks, given the fact that various ideological sectors in Italy, going back to the bad old days of Silvio Berlusconi, maintained privileged relations with Moscow. And then, despite the fact that US imperialism is the guarantor for world imperialism, the guarantor for British imperialism, German imperialism, French imperialism, et cetera, still, the French in particular are interested in making money in China, and whether or not the EU is number 2 to China or number 2 to US imperialism doesn't seem to be that important of an issue to them. And then I would say as well that particularly for the Euro-American left, they need to consider whether or not this rise of China also has import for white supremacy. Not only has import for capitalism and white supremacy. Now, I say this because if you look at my written record, you will find that going back to 1975, as early as 1975, I was writing critiques of China, because as I say in my 16th century book more than once, just as the Protestants cut deals with the Muslims, Ottoman Turkey, Protestant London cutting deals with Ottoman Turkey against the interests of the Catholic Iberians, and that puts the Protestants in the passing lane. So you have communist China basically cutting deals with US imperialism against the interests of not only Moscow, but national liberation movements in Africa. That in return provides massive foreign direct investment into China, creating this juggernaut. And now the United States wants to unscramble the egg. They want to turn back the clock on that deal that they made. And then they expect us to go along with it, up to and including war. Well, I think we should say no. You need to live with your bad deals and certainly not implicate the rest of us. Obviously, I hope that US imperialism should draw the lesson that pretending to be this so-called democracy, while you exclude so many different voices and so many different perspectives under the guise of operating in a marketplace of ideas, that doesn't work. That's not a sustainable proposition. And certainly this conflict with China should give sustenance to that particular point.
You just mentioned Haiti, and I want to get to that in a second. I only have a couple more questions here for you. But before we turn to Haiti, I want to stick with this, with discussing China just for a second, a little more at length. You just mentioned this kind of potential of having consequences of white supremacy and imperialism with regard to the United States and China in this current conflict. I'm curious about what your take on these Belt and Road initiatives of China's on the African continent. Should we view these as similarly imperialist as the kind of history of Britain and the Americas, or the United States on the African continent? Is this a colonial project? This is kind of direct investment into Eastern Africa. Is it imperialist, or should we think of this as maybe a response to Western underdevelopment of the continent? How do you view these competing Western and Chinese interests on the African continent?
Well, the short answer is that it's generally positive, because what's happening at the end of the day is building of infrastructure, building of railroads from the heart of Ethiopia to Djibouti on the Red Sea, or building railroads from Nairobi to Mombasa, for example, or even going back to the 1970s, when one of the first enterprises of Beijing in Africa, building the Tanzam Railway from Zambia to Tanzania on the Indian Ocean coast, which allows for the export of Zambia's copper, which was very important in terms of the anti-apartheid struggle. Now, certainly there are complications, because China has a state sector, but it also has a private sector, and the private sector, like capitalists anywhere, they're looking to exploit labor. They're looking to drive a hard bargain. But I think it's very difficult for the North Atlantic nations, which got fat and happy on the plundering of Africa, and not leaving behind that much infrastructure, by the way, which is why China's had to come in, and complaining about China. And interestingly enough, for the most part, you don't hear these complaints coming from Africa itself. They're looking for a counterweight to French imperialism, for example, the major bloodsucker on the continent. They're looking for a counterweight to British imperialism, for example, which is one of the reasons why you had so much pro-Sovietism in Africa during the Cold War, which is now manifesting in this reluctance to sanction Russia. So, you know the old saying, oftentimes attributed to the 19th century French novelist Balzac, behind every great fortune, there's a crime. And certainly, if you look at the great fortune of China, there are many transgressions, some of which I've written about. You know, waging war in Vietnam after the United States is ousted from Vietnam in 1975, and then China and the United States ganging up on Vietnam because Vietnam had the temerity to oust the genocidal Khmer Rouge from neighboring Cambodia. By the way, I arrived in Cambodia in early 1980, just after the Khmer Rouge were ousted, and it was a political delegation, and then went on to Hanoi. And I talked about the depredations in Africa, which are documented in my book, White Supremacy Confronted. But, you know, I'm willing to let bygones be bygones, as we say. Because, you know, although it's hard to forget, I must say, living through that period, how China, Maoist China misled so many Black people in particular. Not just Black people, of course, but that was the community in which I was enmeshed. And some even today still haven't figured out what happened, believe it or not. But, you know, we're in a new day now. China's now in the crosshairs. And it would not be a step forward if I'm reading a book by the Washington Post hawkish columnist Josh Rogin entitled Chaos Under Heaven. It's about US policy towards China during the Trump years. And he quotes Steve Bannon, the erstwhile Trump advisor. Steve Bannon resuscitates the millennial slogan, which you may recall, Carthage must be destroyed. So Steve Bannon has updated that to say, the Chinese Communist Party must be destroyed. Now, I think that if Steve Bannon's fever dream were somehow to come into being, that would not be a step forward for struggling peoples. And so I think that we have no choice but to resist Steve Bannon's admonition. We have no choice. I mean, it's in our self-interest.
Great, thank you. And just a quick follow-up on that, because I find this really interesting. Just kind of going back to our discussion about left-wing white nationalism, I'm curious if you think the kind of maybe misremembering or forgetfulness of the American left with regard to China, because I know you've talked about the ultra left here in America, and many of whom would identify with the Maoist project or Chinese state communism more generally. Do you think that there's a similar omission here going on with regard to the history of China and US imperialism and so forth?
Well, to a degree, yes, because I think what I've noticed is that the misremembering, to use your phrase, comes into play when considering Maoist China, which I guess you could say dies with Mao himself, 1967, 1977, as being the heroic phase, where even the Chinese Communist Party, and actually, since I should mention, this is something we need to adapt on this side of the Pacific. The line from the China, I lived in Hong Kong for a number of years, and for 1 year. And when I went to teach at Hong Kong University, one of the reasons was to try to understand China, because this was 20 odd years ago. And the formulation from the Chinese Communist Party is that the Maoist years was 70% positive, 30% negative. Now, I like that formulation, even if one can quarrel with the quantities, because unlike the United States, where even the left hardly has a critique of the founding of the United States, despite slave owning and genocide, they could at least say, 60% positive, 40% negative, as opposed to acting like it's just all positive, which is ludicrous. It's ridiculous. All it does, it certainly alienates Black people. And then what happens is that, so it alienates and confuses Black people and sends them off on various, shall we say, unusual political routes. And then that is used as justification for condemning them. This term that I despise, identity politics, which is not applied to the ultimate identity, which is the adoption of this identity of whiteness, which is a new world identity. It's an America's identity. Somehow the US left does not notice that, for example. So supposedly the left, being on the left means you're trying to develop an objective analysis. You're trying to develop an accurate analysis. I'm doing a research project now on the Black Panther Party and struggles from the 1960s and 1970s. And one of the things that strikes me in doing the preliminary research is that they did not necessarily have a firm grasp of the history of this country. But that's understandable, because if you go back and look at the histories of this country, even people whose names I won't mention, even though I criticize them in writing, left-wing and Marxist historians really had a screwy analysis of the 18th century origins of the United States. And I think it misled the Black Panthers into making a fundamental and profound error, which is A, the system is bankrupt. I won't quarrel with that. But B, all it needs is a swift kick in order to come toppling down, which was not accurate. But, or all you have to do is build these alliances, and you sort of downplay settler colonialism, you downplay the whole settler project. You don't put the settler project in the context of similar settler projects in Rhodesia, South Africa, Algeria, for example, or even Australia, Canada, Israel, for example. None of that's going on then. But then again, it's not really going on in US left more broadly, which consider themselves to be ultra sophisticated. So I don't know, it's a very complicated struggle we're talking about.
Great, yeah, that's really interesting, and I really look forward to your work on the Black Panthers. Do you have any
Oh, I just started.
Oh, you just
And
started.
plus,
Okay.
it's sprawling. I started off with the Black Panthers in Los Angeles, Southern California, by the way. And because most of the figures, Eldridge Cleaver is out of Southern California. Of course, Angela Davis, who has a relationship with the Black Panthers and the Communist Party. She's comes to prominence teaching at UCLA. Rochelle McGee, her co-defendant in her trial, comes out of Southern California. A lot of the epical conflicts, such as the shootings at UCLA, come out of, obviously, Southern California. So it's going to take a while because I'm taking on more issues, which means the project is beginning to sprawl.
Great. Do you have time for maybe 3 more quick questions?
Yes, let's go right ahead.
Great. Okay. Returning, we talked a little bit about Haiti in the context of Ukrainian refugees and the United States. It's kind of disproportionate allocation of the acceptance of refugees. Returning to Haiti, you probably already saw that the New York Times released a series on Haiti recently. I think this last week, or maybe it was last week. The series covered the history of the indemnity agreement between Haiti and France, United States colonial project in the 19th and 20th centuries in Haiti. I'm just curious if you read that that series, and if you thought that there were any omissions or anything that we should be made aware of in terms of historical inaccuracies or the manner in which it was reported.
Well, first of all, I commented on that series on Democracy Now! After it came out just a few days ago. I commented on it again on KPFK Los Angeles on the program Sojourner Truth, which is broadcast in Washington, New York, and other cities in the Pacifica Network. The short answer is that on the one hand, it was a step forward. It was published in Creole, the language in Haiti spoken most widely, which is fantastic. On the other hand, any Haitian school child would have been able to knows that Haiti was basically bludgeoned by the French, who forced the new regime post 1804 to pay reparations to the enslavers. Looking at it geopolitically in 2022, it may cause consternation at the highest levels in Paris and Washington, because the French Socialist Party does not come off very well in that. And of course, they haven't done very well in the elections of late in any case, but still they're a formidable force. And indeed, Regis Debray, who old timers may recall from the times that he was supposedly hanging out with Che Guevara and is now an elder in the French Socialist Party, really comes off badly as being a conspirator against Aristide, the early 21st century leader. So hopefully we can reap some geopolitical dividends from that conflict between Paris and Washington. Of course, people in the United States should not think the United States was exempt. I wrote a book, Confronting Black Jacobins, where I point out that the United States, despite its revolutionary pretensions, was hostile to the Haitian Revolution. Many enslavers in this country said, why should we go all the way to Africa to kidnap Africans when you have all these free Negroes right here in Haiti? So that forces the Haitian government to spend more on the military, distorting its economy, because unlike many independent countries, they not only had to worry about being conquered, they had to worry about becoming enslaved. And they then had to build a navy, because the United States was the major importer of enslaved Africans into neighboring Cuba as early as the 1790s. Haiti was trying to stop that. Haiti did not win friends in Washington by having its fingerprints on slave revolts in the United States. Gable's Revolt, 1800 in Virginia, 10 years later in Louisiana, 10 years after that, Denmark Vesey and Charleston, who had sailed in and out of Haiti, in the prelude to that abortive uprising. So then we know about the US occupation of Haiti in 1915 to 1934. the imposition of a kind of neo-slavery in the form of the corvée, C-O-R-V-E-E, of free labor provided by Haitians to build infrastructure. And of course, we know about the successful coup against Aristide. So US nationals should not feel that they're absent from the story.
Mm-hmm. And kind of interesting that the same week, and I got to make sure to watch your appearance on Democracy Now! About this, but interesting that in the same week, I saw on Democracy Now! That the former French ambassador to Haiti had revealed what's long been suspected, and you
Right.
just mentioned it, right? The ousting of Aristide. It's probably safe to assume that there's a similar kind of involvement with the United States and France in the ousting of Jovenel Moïse last year.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any developments that you're aware of?
Well, only that there are US fingerprints on the assassination of Moïse. There are some folks already in detention in South Florida who might be facing trial. Yeah, I was supposed to talk. I gave a talk at the Haitian Studies Institute of the City University of New York, which can be found at their website or on YouTube, which deals with some of these issues. I think in the interest of time, I deleted the portions dealing with the US complicity in the Moïse assassination. But for those who are Haiti files, you might find something of interest in that lecture.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, two final questions, and then I'll let you go here. This is kind of a question that interested me greatly because I heard you speak about it on the Carl Nelson show in February. You gave a brief remark, but it was rather fascinating. You commented on the novel American Spy, which had been written in 2019, I think.
Right.
And was on Obama's must-read list, of course. And it's centered around the assassination of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso in 1987.
Right.
And you just mentioned, and I don't expect you to be able to answer this, because it's a novel, of course, but so I don't expect any sweeping claims coming out of your answer here, but you mentioned that the possibility that there might have been insider knowledge that this author was privy to, given the...
Well, yeah. The only reason I mentioned that is, I read the novel, of course, and I was living in New York in the 1980s at that time, and she has really pointed descriptions that either she was there or she knew somebody who was there. I mean, for example, at that time, whenever any African leader would come to the United Nations, they would make their way to Harlem, to this public school on 127th Street in Harlem. And I think even she mentions even some of the organizers who I knew, because I worked with these people. And so I was thinking to myself that, she must have, either A, she was there, or B, she has good sources. And of course, since we know what her name is, and it shouldn't be that hard to do an investigation if anyone's interested. Yeah, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, though.
I can't either, but that interests me greatly, especially with the kind of, this exigence of the trial of Blaise Compaoré, which just ended.
Yes.
There seems to be something really interesting to be done there in terms of researching this further and perhaps even exposing certain of these links that you were made aware of when reading the novel. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. Okay, my final question, rounding this whole thing out back to the American far right, with this kind of global vantage and view that we've been talking about, I'm curious what you think about, if you can have anything to comment about the global network, the far right's, the right wing's global network. Has the right achieved a sort of right-wing internationalism? I'm thinking about the CPAC, the recent CPAC in Hungary, white supremacist sideshow that we kind of saw. Tucker Carlson and Viktor Orban, kind of ongoing bromance, and Trump and Bannon and Bolsonaro and so forth. Has the right achieved a sort of internationalism that the left has simply failed to focus on and achieve itself?
Yeah, I think that's evident. I mean, if you look at the early stories about January 6th, you'll come to the conclusion that apparently some of the seed money came from Europe to Ali Alexander in particular, who is the rare Black American figure involved in the conspiracy. And some of it may have something to do with this overly rosy and naive view of US history by our friends on the left, and not recognizing the global dynamics that have led to abolition of slavery, retreat of Jim Crow, for example. Because if you abstract out those international factors, then it leads you to a misestimation of the class dynamic, which then leads to what you mentioned in that article against left-wing white nationalism, where you're always preaching for class unity based upon an incorrect analysis of the balance of class forces historically. And it's like the sailor who thinks that he or she is a master sailor when actually it's the winds that help to make for the rapid arrival at the destination, for example. And so many of the left, oftentimes they only look at the winds, the global factors that are impelling us in one direction or another. And then, of course, when we do try to become international, what happens is that you're excoriated. At least, I mean, it's okay to be involved in international religion, be it Islam or Catholicism, headquartered in the Vatican. But if you're on the political left, you're anti-patriotic if you're involved in any sort of international movement. And of course, many of the people on the left have swallowed that poisonous bait. So I think that the answer to your question is evident.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I hope that we can speak again in the future soon, maybe after I read your book on Texas. If I
good.
I just received a copy of it.
I haven't even received a copy yet.
I can send you the PDF if you'd like.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.
Hey, good luck to you.